Are you playing to win or just running out the clock? In sports, the game clock drives every decision. It creates urgency, sharpens focus, and pushes players to perform their best. So what if you treated your life with that same sense of urgency? I've created an exercise to help you do just that. It's called Your Game Clock. Download Your Game Clock today at bill-burke.net/clock. It's free, it's simple yet transformative, and it could be the first step towards achieving peak performance in the areas of your life that matter the most. Remember, life is not a practice run. Every second counts, and your time is now. Welcome to another episode of the Fortitude Forum. I am your host, Bill Burke, and I am so excited to have today's guest with us. He is Todd Martin. He's a former professional tennis player. He's a philanthropist. He's been a tennis coach. He's a speaker. He's even been the CEO of the Tennis Hall of Fame, and I'm excited to welcome him in. Todd, welcome to the show.
Thanks, Bill. Good to see you.
Yeah, absolutely. So I wanted to start at the beginning. So you're from Illinois originally, or at least you were born there.
Yeah.
Talk to me about the attraction to the sport of tennis, because I'm fascinated with it. How was it that you came upon playing the actual game? And when did you think that, hey, I might have some ability and some skill to actually turn pro and make a run at this thing?
Yeah, so most of my childhood was in Northeast Ohio. My dad worked for Goodyear, and then he got transferred to a subsidiary, Motor Wheel, in Lansing, which is how I found myself in Lansing when I was about 10. I learned, like most people most kids in the 70s, like mom, dad introduce you to a sport. I used to chase them up to the park. If I behaved myself while they were playing, I got to play home run derby with my dad a little bit, and it was easier for me to hit a ball with a racket than a baseball bat. And basketball was my first love, but I played every single sport I could get my hands on. I was throwing balls all the time, but there was something about tennis where, one, I was taught really well as a young guy, and then when we moved to Lansing, I connected with a one-shop town and went to that one place and met my life mentor, tennis coach, who transformational in my life. And as I always had high aspirations as an athlete, first I wanted to play college basketball, and then once I realized how slow I was, I started realizing that my tennis was really good. And yeah, and for me, both the nature of how my athleticism manifested in my body, combined with some of my human wiring. I was an introvert. Um, I was comfortable being by myself, and you go out and compete on a pretty large bit of land without anybody to talk to coach you, to solve your problems or to cause problems for you. And that ultimately really was a good partnership and a good alignment with tennis. And I found that I was growing as a human more and more the more I played.
Wow. Yeah. So many differences between individual sports and team sports. I come from a team sport atmosphere, but I'm fascinated now because of my wife. She's made me this huge tennis fan. The tennis channel is on nonstop all day. I told her she's got one more month until football season, and then we're
Yeah.
going to have to move that to a different TV. But yeah, it's really fascinating to me. And I'm more fascinated with the mental side of what these players go through. And just to see them out there working through some of those things is very interesting. But you took a somewhat unique route, and you actually played college tennis, which is not what a lot of these players do. How did your experience at Northwestern in those early days start to shape your response to pressure and your composure and maybe even your belief in yourself?
Yeah, in tennis, most seniors in high school, juniors in high school who ultimately will play professional tennis start to participate in professional tournaments, like the farm leagues of the farm leagues, but as amateurs. And I did that the summer after my senior year, and I got laughed at the entire time. So I was so far away from being prepared to compete professionally. I was graduating from high school. It hadn't even crossed my mind that professional tennis would be a reality. It only was a dream, and it was a dream that is had slowly had morphed into a goal, but it still felt a long ways away. So when I was choosing school, Northwestern was not an athletics powerhouse, and not in tennis either. Um, I chose to go to school there because I knew I was going to have to utilize an education to course a career ultimately. Um, I never would have dreamt that I'd leave after my sophomore year because athletically I was so developed and ready for professional tennis that it was bona fide time. But I was a late developer. I went to college. I was probably 6'4". By the time I left after my sophomore year, I was 6'6". I probably put on, I don't know, 20 to 25 pounds worth of weight. And that was not beer weight. That was muscle. And I had benefited from, frankly, a lot of suppression of my interest in tennis throughout my childhood. My parents only allowed me to play so much during the school year, like 6 hours a week, unless I was competing in a tournament. Whereas most of my peers in that age group would have been 15 to 20 hours a week on the court. So when I got to college and I went from 6 hours a week of practice to 10 hours of practice with much better talent and growth and better competition, that flywheel got going pretty quickly. And so Northwestern, and I believe this would have been the case no matter where I would have gone to school. I think Northwestern was a perfect fit for me culturally, and especially within the team and coaching dynamic. But I grew physically, I grew in independence, I grew emotionally and personally. And it's those other elements, and grew athletically, but it's those other elements of emotional and personal independence that were most integral in being able to navigate life on a pro tour. I left prematurely the most comfortable setting I could have possibly been in. I loved my friends. I had a great social network. I had a team. It was, it's college. It's the best time of our lives. And you leave that to go live a nomadic lifestyle among people that you don't really know. And those people that you don't really know are also they're both your peers and your adversaries. If And I didn't know it at the time, but if I had not been well prepared through my experiences at Northwestern and throughout my childhood, thanks to my parents and my mentor, I wouldn't have been able to endure the rigor of playing professional tennis as an independent contractor slash business operator when I was not competitively successful. I failed for a couple of years on the tour before I finally got in competing successfully.
Yeah, that's really interesting because you mentioned some of the players that start really early and that's all they do basically from the time they're little kids. And of course,
Yeah.
a lot of them burn out. One of your adversaries on the tour, Andre Agassi, is famous from his story of burning out and just being pressured to play constantly. So you definitely took the alternate route, but it sounds like it was the exact route that you needed to have all the success that you did. And not only did you battle Andre, but some of the biggest legends of tennis ever in history at that time. And I sympathize with you because my senior year at Michigan State, I feel like we had a really good team, had a great year, but we ended up playing that year against a really stacked conference with guys like Tom Brady and Drew Brees. These are future NFL Hall of Famers. So I'm like, man,
Yeah.
in any other year, we might have had a couple of more wins, but it was still great. But Andre Agassi, Jim Courier, Pete Sampras, Michael Chang, those are huge names in tennis history, and
Yeah.
you had to go toe to toe with them. I'm just curious, how did you mentally prepare to go against those giants, especially when you weren't necessarily the favorite going into those matches?
Yeah, and I don't know how you felt with Brady and Breeze and the overall strength of the Big Ten, but for me, these fellas that you just mentioned are all essentially my age peers, and they were professionals 2 to 4 years ahead of me, maybe even longer than that in a way. and they wouldn't have known who I was until I turned pro and started playing against them. For me, I, the first and most important thing for me was getting into a great training environment as a professional. Our national governing body assigned me to a Spanish coach who married an American and has been in California for decades now, Jose Higueras. And Jose ultimately was an amazing mentor and coach for me. And then coincidentally, through his own devices, Jim Courier started working with Jose as well. So I not only had a level of coaching and instruction that was top of the heap, but then I also discovered a training environment where I was sparring with when Jim started. He was 20th in the world, so a far higher level of sparring practice than I had ever had. And 6 months later, he was probably 6 to 9 months later, he was probably number one in the world or close to it. And so those two things were super important to me. And then what I what I learned soon after I started taking body punches from Jim, just get blown out day after day in practice, but I was getting blown out maybe just a little bit less day after day, to the point where I started to feel competitive with that one individual. And it was probably in that time, in that orientation with Jim, where I started to say subconsciously, I need to reframe what my peer group is. I could either continue to measure myself against the other collegians who had evolved into professional tennis and were, let's say, making a living and sustaining themselves on the tour, or I could be true to the dream when I was a kid, the evolved goal of being at the top of the game professionally, being on center court at Wimbledon, competing for US Open trophies, etc. So there's a bit of I think there was a bit of a switch back in the day that went off that said, yes, these four guys are way ahead of me today, but I at least know I have access and connectivity with one of them. If that's the case, and if he barely beats me on the practice court one day, and then he goes and beats the other guy in competition the next day. I studied the transitive property at one point in time. That can't be too far away from achievable for me. And fortunately, I was delusional enough to believe that and actualize that. And on the contrary, I was probably never arrogant enough to think that it should be an expectation. And that second part probably limited me on those final hurdles of becoming more than just a very good tennis player and being a bona fide great tennis player.
Yeah, that's really interesting. There's a fine line there between being maniacal about the outcome, of winning
Yeah.
some of those tournaments, but also the perspective of just becoming the best version of ourselves day in and day out and getting a little better than yesterday. So that's a really tough mental tightrope to walk, but it sounds like you did a great job. And you mentioned Wimbledon.
Yeah.
So correct me if I'm wrong, but two Grand Slam finals and then multi semifinals.
Yeah.
How do you, as a tennis player, maintain the mental toughness and fortitude to consistently go deep in those tournaments? Because it's one thing to get bounced in the first or second round, but to go deep, that's really not only a physical challenge, but really a mental one as well.
Yeah. I mean, I'll try not to drone on, but tennis is a pretty interesting sport from a calendar perspective. Where I traveled probably 35 weeks a year. Um, some of that was due to traveling in order to train. I didn't train at home, so I had isolation training out in California with Jose. We start January 1 and we end Yeah, essentially mid to late November, depending on how we do in team events and individual competition. That you cannot sustain excellence for a 40 to 44 week period of time. It's not humanly possible. And fortunately, I was educated in periodization while I was pretty young in high school. And not that I understood how to master it, but I understood that the body wasn't meant to perform at a consistent level. And um, there was, I think, because I was hyper process oriented and not hyper result oriented, I had a natural inclination, a natural development inclination as opposed to a performance inclination. So if I were obsessed with performance, I would have lived and died with every tournament that I won or lost. And I only won 8 my entire career. I made a practice of losing once a week. But with that, our 4 major tournaments are spread out anywhere from several months apart from one another to several weeks apart from one another. And that's impossible to periodize for yourself, but it's not impossible to manage within reason. So I played well. I cared about my results. I put my best foot forward every week I competed, but I scheduled myself from a rest, from a competition, and from a training standpoint, all geared towards being at my best when the Australian Open, French Open, Wimbledon, and the US Open came around. It it was not a scientific success, but I do think anecdotally, if you reviewed careers, I think you would see a level of performance at the slams that was unique for me and some others. Some would say I overperformed at the Grand Slams, and I might say I was just thoughtful about my approach. And if others were more process oriented, they might have enjoyed some of that same success. My ranking ebb and flow was pretty interesting. And even in my lesser years, I had some pretty strong results at the Grand Slams, which I always felt was evidence of the right approach.
Yeah, I've always wondered. I'm watching these tournaments with my wife, and I'm like, man, that they were just on the other side of the world a day ago. And then I've always wondered about jet lag. Is that a thing? Like, how do you keep that level of performance up consistently? It sounds like it's, like you said, near impossible, especially when you're trying to legitimately put everything you have into every single match and every single tournament. And you mentioned some of those Grand Slams. Yours, that comeback win in 1999 in the U.S. Open, you battled cramps, I think, or injuries. You were down match points, which is fascinating to watch people come back from. That's the stuff that we all tune in to see, right? Somebody coming back from near defeat, certain defeat, and to pull it out. So, what I'm just curious, do you remember back to that specific match? What types of reserves of grit did you have to call on in that mental battle with yourself to pull out that win?
Yeah, I had at the majors, we play every other day. We play five set matches, best of 5 set matches, which for me was always an advantage. Slow and steady wins the race as opposed to needing to be spot on right from the get-go. But I had food poisoning. This was the 4th round out of 7. I made it to the finals that year. But I had a food poisoning or a stomach bug of some sort the day before. I had ended up on an IV drip that day. So I didn't practice. I really was depleted and frankly I was hoping to be able to make it through that match and lose with some dignity because I honestly I didn't walk onto the court believing I had a chance. I was playing against a good player and I knew I was going to have to play well in order to beat him. But fortunately, as an American, I asked for the US Open to schedule my match as late as possible that next day. So it gave my body just a little bit more time to recover. less conditions to battle environmentally. I lost I lost the first two sets. I think 7-5, 6-love, or 6-3, 6-love. It was not close, but at the same time, at 5-3 in the third set, my opponent blinked for a moment and just gave me a little bit of an open door. And by the time you sneak through that set, and I was thinking to myself, wait a second, I don't feel any worse than I did at the beginning of the match. If anything, I probably feel a little bit better than I did at the beginning of the match. And I had momentum. I'd rather be down 2-1, having won the third set, than being down 2-1, having lost the third set. And this is the situation I found myself in. And then it was just that actually stimulated just a mindset change
Mm-hmm.
from trying to lose gracefully to, wait a second, I am supposed to compete to win. I'm not supposed to compete just to lose gracefully. And that really got, I think, accentuated the momentum change for the crowd, for me, and for my opponent, right? Like the finish line is a devastating thing in our sport because we don't have a clock. We can't take a knee. We can't bleed the 24-second shot clock. We have to play, and you have to sprint across that finish line. And there were loads of times where I got to the finish line and didn't finish the race. And this was one of those times where my opponent ran into a little bit of the same into the same situation.
Yeah, that finish line for tennis players, I've never thought of it that way, but I would assume the best and the ones that become champions are really the ones that can accelerate as they get closer to the finish line instead of letting up a little bit. That whole thing, you see it all the time. A tennis player is up by games or sets and then ends up losing it when they should have won the match. And it's such a mental thing. So I'm just completely fascinated by it. So you mentioned that finish line and the results, of course, which you're all after. All athletes are after that win and that title and the bragging rights and the trophies. But how did you start to define success outside of the wins and losses, especially when in a sport like tennis, when there's only one person out of two that holds up that trophy
Yeah.
at the end of every tournament, and of course can call themselves a winner after every single match?
If I honestly, I go back to childhood. I lost a lot. In team sports, if my basketball team when I was in 7th grade, if we lost, but I scored points, there was a consolation. If I scored points and we lost, if I didn't score points and we won, there was success. And so there was always for me, there was always a way to look at the positive element of the competition. And my parents very much were believers that athletics were a way to augment the development of a child, not an end in itself. They did not raise an athlete, they raised a boy to become a man. And it just so happened that sports was an important part of that development for me. My childhood coach and mentor had a great saying: value value the result, focus on the process. And because I was relatively unsuccessful when I was growing up as an athlete, there was so many times where those around me were illustrating to me, look at all the ways you just won. Yes, you shook hands and told the other guy congratulations, but look at all the ways that you won. You had a game plan, you executed that game plan, that game plan wasn't working and you adapted well to it. You clearly were more successful in a certain skill than you were the last tournament you played a few weeks ago, whatever it might have been. There was always a realistic and positive reinforcement of what I was doing. It was not, it was never you're going to be number one ultimately. You're the best. There was no sugarcoating. It was a bona fide identification of where the progress was by the adults that were in my space and influential in my life. And it ingrained in me that same type of outlook. When Dweck wrote about growth mindset, it seemed utterly unscientific because that was what I had, and that's the only life I knew. And I give all that credit to my parents and my childhood mentor. And what it ultimately also did was frame who do I choose as an adult to be in my circle? Who am I hiring to help me with my strength and conditioning? Who am I choosing to be my agent? Who do I want to hang around with on tour and seek mentorship from older players? It led me into a direction where I wasn't going to make some really bad mistakes in how to manage my life and career because I knew what felt right and I knew what was right by sake of my parents and my mentor.
Yeah, it's things that I'm trying to instill in my kids, right? It's not easy for some to have that growth mindset, but that really is the way. That's the only way if you have big goals and dreams and you want to get better. As tough as it is, and I struggled with it as a young athlete as well. Nobody likes to hear criticism and that they need to improve upon something. And the college world that I grew up in, for the guy that I played for, Nick Saban, there wasn't a lot of praise for the good things that you did, but
Yeah.
we were better off for it, and I am certainly now as well. I want to talk or just ask you at least one question about another legend that was in your world, and that's he's one of the greatest tennis players to ever do it, and that's Novak Djokovic. You actually got the opportunity to coach him after your playing days were done. And I once heard him talk about how during a tennis match, what separates good from great players is not who hits the most winners, but who can recover the quickest mentally from a bad point or a bad shot and get back to the neutral center of the road mentality and forget it. And that's something that I really had to do as a quarterback as well. It's the next play. The clock's ticking down and you got to move on regardless of whether the last one was good or not. So, what did you take away or what did he impress upon you even as a young player in terms of his mental toughness?
And that you just referenced it, but it bears emphasis, and that is recovery from the bad, of course, but recovery from the good as well. If this is what leads to people not crossing the finish line in tennis. We get excited about success that has led us to the finish line and distractions of what happens on the other end of the finish line. Like once we cross, what's the celebration going to be like? What do I say to the guy I just beat? What are the press going to say? Whatever it might be, who do I play tomorrow? All of that. And from a very early age, it was clear that Novak had really good perspective on that. And when you talk about recovery, or when Novak talks about recovery, it's good to have it framed in the lens of emotional recovery point to point and being prepared to play 20 seconds later and our next play. But his emphasis on physical recovery day in and day out was the most scientific and progressive mindset I had ever seen. Novak is a very smart and well-educated young man, and I coached him when he was 22, 23, and he had scientists around him that there was one time where it looked as though he was on his deathbed at the end of the season. He needed rest, and he was playing in a tournament with the best 8 players of the year. And my my instinct when I was playing would have been, I've got a day off. I'm going to chill. I'm going to put my feet up. I'm going to get treatment. I am not going to exercise. I need a day off. And those around him, strength and conditioning coach, physical therapist, they insisted that he exercise. They insisted that he probably have 45 minutes worth of exercise. And it could have been coordination stuff. It could have been little quick muscle stimulus, but it was scientific, and anything scientific, Novak always aligned with. He was immature at the time. He was unprepared for some of the responsibility that the King of Serbia has. He's essentially the King of Serbia even then. And at the same time, he had some real wisdom. He said at one point in time early in our relationship to another player that I was debating with, this other kid was a bit of a slacker. And Novak just finally interjected and he said, the champion comes from within. And he's 22 at the time, 22. And I was 30, I guess I was 39, almost 40. And I didn't have the wisdom to say it that succinctly in my own native language. And he figured out how to say it in just a few words. What I was debating, and he just finally said it, and it was the end. It was the end of the debate. It was not something that he was ready to be held accountable to, but his success since then demonstrates at every turn that the champion within him has come out.
Wow, that is such a great story. I love hearing that. Thanks for sharing that. It's powerful. And of course, he is a powerful player, but to see or to hear you paint the picture of the seeds of his champion mindset is really cool. I want to ask you about this too, because I know you're passionate about this. You, after your playing days were done, you started a foundation, the Todd Martin Youth Leadership Foundation. Why is building that mental toughness and leadership in young people so important to you? Because I've seen firsthand the important work and the ripple effect that it's caused. So I'm just curious, what prompted you or what calling did you feel to start that organization?
So, Bill, we actually founded it when I was 23, just a couple or 3 years into my career, not after my career. And like most things good in my early life, my parents and my mentor, Rick Furman, who I've referenced several times already, they were instrumental in it. It was Rick's idea. I came home from Wimbledon. It was my first successful Wimbledon. I made it to the quarterfinals there. And I came home and he sat down with me and he said, it's time to do something. I know how much you love kids. I'd always wanted to be an elementary school teacher. You're clearly a beneficiary of the sport and you love the sport dearly. And he said, I don't know if you necessarily realize it, but this community of Lansing has been really important in your development. And I couldn't argue with any of those 3 points. And Rick was really involved in the sport nationally and ultimately was the executive director of the USTA. And he knew ways to make that uh, to make those things happen, which is when we formed the organization. Initially, Bill, it was just about how do we get rackets in the hands of those who wouldn't normally. How do we give opportunity that that I didn't know life without opportunity. It was just if I wanted to try something, my parents allowed me to try something. In fact, football was the only thing my parents didn't let me play because my father was a high school football player and he busted up his shoulder and he said, I wouldn't want that for you. Um, and, you know, inherently, we knew that there was a community of kids that were not receiving similar opportunity. And if we could do a little bit, we knew that would be a positive. So we started essentially with summer camp, rackets in hands, and good young adult role models for young kids that were at risk. We discovered really quickly that that was not going to be enough to serve the need of the community, nor make us feel like the organization was pulling its weight. And so it was then that we enlisted actually a former Michigan State football player named John Shinsky. I don't know if you know that name or not.
Mm-hmm.
And
Yep.
a former Michigan State trustee who was mentor to my mentor, Jack Shingleton. And they took the ball and ran with it and started to formulate a bit of a youth leadership curriculum based largely off of Stephen Covey's son's work. And then iteration after iteration, and now 30 plus years later, we have a program that serves thousands of kids annually, and an organization that is in its finest chapter, despite me being outside of the public eye and never having lived in Lansing since we founded in 93.
No, it's a tremendous organization. What you're doing is truly remarkable. I had a chance to speak to some of the kids earlier this week, and man, it just made my week. It was just so wonderful to look in their eyes and just see the excitement and the learning that's taking place and the opportunity, like you mentioned, that they might not have gotten any other way. It's
Yeah.
just kudos to you and the staff there. It's just been tremendous to get to know more about what's going on there. And again, it's all about impact, right? We're all trying to pay it forward and have impact through the different vehicles and the different gifts that we've been given. Thanks for sharing that. Speaking of starting early, what's one maybe mental toughness trait that a lot of players who might be coming up that are young now might be overlooking that they start or should start working on earlier in their careers?
There's a load, but what I would start with is goal setting. And that's not goal setting. I want to be the starting quarterback, or I want to be ranked a certain number or score a certain number of points. It's goal setting as to long-term goal setting. What do I hope to accomplish in the future? Like that, if that gets crystallized in a young person's life, be that academically, be that extracurricularly, either arts or athletics, I think then it allows that young person to hold themselves accountable and to learn accountability at such an early age. And then as mentors and coaches and the such that are around those young people, is just remind them, what do you hope to accomplish? And what are you doing at this moment? What have you done today? What have you done this week, this month, this year in order to pursue fulfillment of that accomplishment or of that goal? If that is well, if that is well articulated and written, be bold enough to write it down, then I think it's just a great compass that none of us take a linear path to success. But directionally, if we do have that goal, then there's loads of different ways to achieve those goals. There's Bobby Knight on one hand, and then there's, in the same city or in the same state, Tony Dungy on the other hand. Totally different methodologies, and both remarkably successful coaches. And accountability would have been a norm between those two. Goal setting probably was a norm between those two, but their day-to-day ethos and one might have believed more in rest, one might have believed more in two-a-days, one might have believed in militaristic endeavor, and another might have been more, let me put my arm around you and tell you the facts of life here. And so but I do think that at the origin of most of it is clarity and purpose. And I think there's a huge value in writing that purpose down, reviewing it, and because some of us are fortunate to achieve those goals and then need to reframe them and make them even bolder and seemingly less attainable. But boy, yeah, that was a really impactful part of my early development as an athlete.
Very well put. It sounds simple, but unfortunately, not enough people share that or put into practice that same intentionality. So I love that answer. So much thanks and gratitude to you, Todd, for doing this. So, what's next for you? What are you excited about that you have coming up in the future? And then, where can the listeners continue to follow your path and your success?
I am not very easily followable. I guess I'm an old fuddy-duddy Gen Xer that uses social media to follow what's going on, but I don't like the overall method. So do I can be found. I work for a company called Swing Racket and Paddle. I'm Chief Strategy and Operations Officer. I'm only a few months into the role, but we're building really large tennis, pickleball, and padel venues across the Southeast, starting in Raleigh, North Carolina. And this is for me, it's a return to the participation side of our sport, which is where my joy and passions originated, and marrying them with a corporate leadership executive role. So I'm really excited about it. I speak occasionally, and if you Google me on as far as wanting to listen to me speak or ramble on anymore, that's where you can find me that way.
Well, awesome. Check out Todd and follow the journey. So grateful that you were able to share so many great stories and insights for the listeners. So thanks for being here, Todd.
Yeah, and I'll make one more shameless plug. Todd
Yeah.
Martin Youth Leadership, tmyl.org. And I'm also accessible that way, but I would love for your listeners to poke around on our website and see what we're up to.
Awesome. Thanks, Todd.
Thank you, Bill.